Check.
Hi everyone, my name is Wyeth Howard and I am one of the Senior Assistant Directors in the Office of Financial Assistance. So I primarily work with BU's Financial Literacy Program and with the communications team. But tonight we're going to talk about basically an intro to financial wellness. So when thinking about financial wellness, there are usually a couple of factors that go into that. The first and probably the most basic and also the most important is, get this to change, living smart on a student budget. So when you're looking at how you're living while at school, while home, after you graduate, usually a budget is your first and basic step into kind of living smart financially. So when looking at a budget, really the first thing you want to look at is, where does your money go? What are you spending money on? So that can be, in my case, food. I spend a lot of money on takeout food. I'm sure a lot of other people do. It's essential, but it's also can eat up a lot of our wallets. Some of the other things you might spend your money on is entertainment, transportation, either a T-Pass or Lyft and Uber. That's what I do a lot. Books for school, your laundry, or even just your kind of daily activities with your friends if you go out on weekends. I know right now we're not really going out on weekends, but hopefully eventually we will be doing that again. And those are all expenses that you want to take into account with a budget. So looking a little deeper at what budgeting is, primarily it's an account of your income and expenses for a period of time. So when you're looking at your expenses, there are usually three main types that you want to look at. You have fixed expenses, which is your rent, your utilities, your car payment, cell phone bill, internet. Basically those expenses that you know you have every month and they're at a fixed cost. Utilities can vary a little bit, but for most of those, you know your internet bill is $50 a month, your cell phone bill is $50 a month, and it's that way every month. So you have to plan to pay that consistently. Kind of the opposite of that are your variable expenses. So those are things like food, transportation, credit cards, clothing, your laundry, your entertainment, basically expenses that you have at a pretty regular basis, but can change depending on your habits. So if you eat out 3 times in 1 week, but only once the next week, that's going to be a different expense. So how do you account for those kind of variable expenses in your budget? The final one is irregular expenses. So gifts, haircuts, oil changes, if your car breaks down, those are things that you know you will have to pay eventually, but you may not be paying them every week or every month. So you want to plan for having kind of the cash reserve to pay for that when it does come up. So if we were to look at an example, assuming you have no savings and you aren't getting kind of financial help from anyone else, this is kind of a basic budget for a student who may be working and earning $85 a week. So you can see that's what their weekly income is. And then if we look a little bit more at their expenses, you can see things like food, coffee, transportation, laundry, entertainment, and maybe you put $5 a week in savings. It's important to kind of look at this and maybe compare it to how you maybe spend every week or every month and see some similarities here. Do you spend a lot of money on coffee? When I was going into the office, I usually get a coffee every day. So I plan on kind of having that monthly budget for that so it doesn't kind of build up. Traditionally in the winter, I end up taking a lot more Lyft than I do during the summer. So that's something I know that I have to account for in my fall budget and winter budget. So those are all things you kind of want to look at when looking at what your expenses are. So you can see the total expenses here are $113. So looking at kind of a rough budget for this student, you see they have their income of $85, their expenses of $113, which leads to a deficit of $28. This is why it's really important to kind of look at this stuff, because you have your income and you get it regularly and in one amount, but your expenses, they don't all come at once. So it's one of those things where you may not feel like you're spending a lot of money if you're getting a coffee here or taking a Lyft there, but it really kind of builds up throughout the week, and soon you might be in a position where you're spending more than you're making. Mainly the important thing that you want to look at with this too, before I move to the next slide, the reason this is important is because when you're spending more than you're making, the start of when you might use a credit card or building up kind of unintended debt, which would come back to impact you later. So looking at what are some ways that you can close that gap between your income and your expenses, there are a couple of things you can look at. One primary way you could do is to increase your income. If you have some extra time, maybe you can get a second job. Then you can kind of continue spending at the rate you are, but you have that higher income, so you're no longer losing money each week. That's very situational. You may not be able to get a second job if you are going to school and already maybe working one work-study job. That might be kind of all of your time. So if you aren't able to increase your income, then you want to start looking at how can you decrease your expenses. So one of the best ways to look at this is walking or biking. Not only is it free exercise, but it also cuts down on any expenses you might have for a T-Pass or Lyft and Uber. Lyft for me is a big one. You may take a couple rides and they may be $5, but over the course of a month, it can end up to be a couple $100. If you can cut out maybe a third of those by walking up and down campus or walking to somewhere you're going that's nearby, that can be a quick way to cut down on the difference between your income and expenses for a week or a month, and really kind of even out that budget. Another thing you can look at doing is setting limits and expectations for your friends or family. So if you go out to eat regularly, but you don't really kind of put any limits on when you do it, maybe instead of going out to eat on weekdays, you say, I'm only going to go out to eat on the weekends. That right there can kind of cut maybe your expenses for the week from 3 meals to 2 meals. Another thing you can look at doing, and especially with these two, you want to look at how are these going to help you avoid kind of using a credit card and building debt now. So that's why you want to look at paying for this with the money that you have on hand. So when you're looking at what you're spending and the debt you're taking on, one of the most important things you want to know is what you owe. Keeping track of your credit card statements each month and information if you have student loans. Most students throughout their time in college will have some sort of student loan. So keeping track of that total amount and your interest rates and what you're paying on that is a very important thing for not only kind of managing your expenses now, but also setting you up for future when beyond graduation, you're going to be needing to pay that back. So at the end of the day, the most important thing is not to spend more than you make. You may need a lifestyle change, whether it be walking or biking more or eating out a little bit less each week, or taking on a second job, something to kind of make the numbers work where you're no longer spending more than you're making each week or month, depending on how you want to build your budget. Another kind of important thing about living financially smart is building savings. There are a lot of kind of different strategies for effective ways to build savings. I find that the most effective way is to make sure that you pay yourself first. Let's say that you make sure you want to save $1,000 a year or $100 a month. If you get paid and then you say, okay, at the end of the month, I'll put $50 into my savings account. Throughout the course of the month, things are going to come up. You may have an additional expense. You may choose to eat out once more. And those things can cut into the money that's available for you at the end of the month to put into your savings. Alternatively, if you get paid and the first thing you do with your money is put that money into your savings account, then you know that it's in there, you've met your goal for the month, and throughout the course of the month, you don't have things that'll eat into that amount that you can save. Another really important thing to do with this too is you want to set long-term goals. So if you have a goal of maybe $1,000 for the year that you want to save, that's good, but you also want to make sure you're setting short-term goals. It can be daunting to think about your income and think about making sure that you have $1,000 at the end of the month. But if you break it up and say maybe $20 a week or $50 a month, you not only have that long-term goal that you're building towards, but you also have those smaller short-term goals that you're meeting regularly. And you can kind of see your money grow that way. So it can be a good way to mentally just kind of make it a little bit more easier to start the habit of building savings where you're meeting that monthly and weekly goal and getting into that habit rather than doing it over a longer period of time. Another important thing with savings too that you want to look at is having an emergency fund. So for those expenses that maybe come up that you know that you might eventually have, but you don't know when you're going to have them. If your car breaks down, if you have some sort of a one-time expense, having an emergency fund is great for that, because then you know you have the money that you'll need when you need it. Saving is kind of primarily, you want to start to build that emergency fund with your savings, and then as you continue to build your savings, then you have that money there also for additional purchases after. So this graph is kind of a quick example of not only savings, but how you can save effectively to build more money. So if you look at the red line, that is if you have an initial investment of $1,000, it'll take, with a 4% interest rate, 18 years to double your investment. There's nothing wrong with that, but if you were to, let's just say you added $20 a month in savings to your initial investment, with the way interest compounds, which is the interest every month gets added to your original principal to then build more interest. So it's basically reinvesting itself. If you take that same $1,000 and you add $20 a month over that same 18 years, you'll have over $8,000 rather than just doubling your money. So it's an effective way of taking advantage of kind of that habit of saving with not much additional kind of contribution from your end to really maximize your potential savings over the long term. So another important thing with not only budgeting, but thinking about kind of your financial success is looking at student loans. Most students are going to have some sort of a student loan in college, but there are ways and different tips you can have to manage those effectively to kind of set yourself up for success after you graduate. One of the biggest tips, and it isn't always the easiest thing to do, but if you can borrow less, that's the best way to kind of decrease your loan payments or your repayment time after you graduate. There are effective ways to do that, though, where you can reduce kind of your total borrowing without maybe kind of having to decrease your expenses along the way. One example of this is the federal Stafford loans. Most students will receive these while they're in school. Every student has a maximum eligibility for those loans, but most of them are awarded for expenses that they may not have to pay directly through school. So for example, if your loans include a stipend for $1,000 of books, at the BU bookstore, that's how much your books might cost. But if you're able to get them cheaper off of Amazon or off of online, if you use digital textbooks, you may not need that full amount for books for that semester. So if you decrease your loans by the difference, that can make a huge difference in your total amount that you've borrowed over the course of your 4 years in college. Even if you're able to reduce your loans by $100 or a couple $100 each semester, that definitely adds up over time. So that's something you want to take a look at if you can, if you see that you have a credit on your account, or maybe you don't need the full amount for that semester. Rather than taking it and then having that credit, maybe look at instead reducing your loans so that you have a little bit less to repay later. Another thing you can look at with student loans is making interest payments while in school. Everyone's student loans, especially if they're the federal type, will either be subsidized or unsubsidized. So the subsidized loans won't accrue any interest while you're in school, but the unsubsidized loans will. So if you look at the amount of interest accruing on your unsubsidized loans and just pay towards that while you're in school, that can decrease your repayment time after, because you won't have that accumulated interest from the 4 years you haven't been making payments. So you'll go into your repayment period just paying on your principal rather than having to pay down a large amount of interest that you've kind of stacked up over those 4 years. Another thing is repaying them as soon as possible. So when you graduate, students are most likely on a 10-year repayment plan. But if you are able to make payments sooner to that, rather than just waiting out the 10 months, or the 10 years, sorry. If you make payments sooner, then that's less time that you'll be able to accrue interest. So it'll decrease the total amount you have to pay over the long term. And then another thing is you don't also want to build consumer debt as a result. So keep in mind of your student loans, but also any spending you're doing on credit cards, kind of your monthly spending with that, you want to make sure you're managing both of those things. So talking about credit, especially with a budget, and eventually in your life, you'll have to use credit for something. So it's a big part of kind of understanding credit is a big part of living smart financially. Looking at what credit is, most people have a general idea, but there's kind of a lot more that goes into building good credit and kind of establishing your credit to begin with. So looking at credit, at its core, what it is providing money, goods, or services with the expectation of future payment. So basically, borrowing money with the intention to pay it back later. So looking at your credit, and you may have heard of a credit report and a credit score. So basically that is kind of your credit worthiness, the faith that the lenders have that you will be able to repay that amount of money. There's a little bit of a difference between a credit report and a credit score. The credit report is a detailed report of your entire credit history. So it has information regarding your credit card accounts, your loans, your payment history, and it's used by lenders and other companies to determine basically what you would be eligible for in credit. It also contains information on your employment history, also your address information, since it's used in a lot of times to determine if you're eligible to lease an apartment. That's all contained in there. So traditionally, there are three major credit reporting industries. You have Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. If you contact any of these companies to get a credit report, they each will charge you, but you can get one free credit report a year through annualcreditreport.com. It's a really good idea to start looking at your credit report. So even if you only get one a year, maybe you look at doing it when you do your taxes. If you do your taxes, you remember also pull your credit report just to get a look at how your credit history is, what's being reported on you, see if there are any errors, something that doesn't look good or doesn't look right, and also to get a look at where your progress is. That's a good habit to get into kind of as you, especially after you graduate, to kind of have that in your head before you get there. So in addition to your credit report, you will also have a credit score, which is a numerical rating to reflect your credit worthiness. So this method was developed by the Fair Isaac Corporation, and it's basically a standard method of calculating the score. So the things that go into it are your payment history, which is, do you pay on time? Is there any delinquency? How severe are your late payments? Then you have your amount owed, which is your debt to available credit ratio. So the amount of available credit you have compared to the amount of credit you've used and not paid. Also, the amount owed takes into account the number of accounts you have with balances. You have your length of history. So if you're looking at to close an account, you want to make sure that you aren't closing your oldest account, because the longer you have a line of credit, the more positive that impacts your credit score. You also have new credit, which is recently opened accounts, the number of inquiries. So if you are taking out a loan and also looking for an apartment, that might be multiple inquiries on your credit. And also your account mix. So what type of credit you have. Do you have revolving versus installment accounts? Basically a credit card versus student loans or a car payment. Basically, all of these things show that when determining a credit score, these credit companies are looking for a wide variety of credit, that you're using your credit, paying down your credit, that you are doing it over a long period of time, and that you are doing it on time. So there's a lot of elements that go into determining your credit score. So making sure that you are not neglecting any single one of those can be a big determining factor in where your credit score ends up being. You can also, if you go to myfico.com, get an estimate of your credit score. They range from 300 to 850. And the main thing that a credit score is going to do is it's going to determine your interest rates. That's why you want to work on developing that now, so that when you do need to use your credit later on, you're looking at, if you have a score of 700, maybe you're looking at an 8% interest rate, whereas if you have a score of 500, you're looking at a 20% interest rate, which is going to decrease what you're going to pay for things over time. So that's why it's important to kind of start looking at that now, even though you may not be completely using it at the moment. So looking at negative information, basically those are late payments, if you aren't paying the full amount or you're paying late, all these things will stay on your credit for 7 to 10 years. So they will clear eventually, but even a small negative hit on your credit now could still impact you 5-10 years from now when you are looking to use your credit. So that's why it's important to be mindful of this and make sure you're getting to these good habits now so that you can get the most of your credit later when you need it. So here's kind of a quick example of why this is important. So let's say you have your credit card and you went to buy headphones for $400 and you wanted to finance them. So with your credit score, you're given an interest rate of 23% with a minimum payment of $15. Looking at kind of how much you'll actually end up paying for these headphones, if you pay the minimum of $15, you'll end up paying $565 over the lifetime of that loan. So 38 months, that's over $165 in interest. Alternatively, if you pay a little bit more than the minimum, if you pay $30 a month, it'll only take you 16 months, but you'll pay $66 in interest. So this kind of highlights a couple of things. The paying it down sooner, if you can pay more and pay it a little bit quicker, you're saving yourself money and interest, almost $100. Also, that credit score and that interest rate, 23% is a huge interest rate. And you can see if you're making the minimum payments on that, you're paying almost half the price of the product in interest just because of the impact of your credit score. So then you want to look at kind of what can you do to reduce your interest rate. So that's where it comes back to kind of all of those things listed on the credit report and the factors of determining your credit score. If you're making not only on-time payments, but you're using your credit card to accumulate debt and then paying off that debt, if you have kind of a wide range of credit. So for students coming out of college, you usually don't have a lot of credit, but paying your student loans is actually one of the easiest building blocks to get you started on your credit. When you start repaying your student loans, if you make those monthly payments, that right there is how you'll kind of start developing your credit. Also, if you have one credit card, maybe you don't use it a lot, but they want to see that you use it every month and that you pay it. So if you have a credit card, maybe now you get it and you buy chapstick and then you pay it off at the end of the month. And that's all you do with that credit. But showing that you're using your credit and paying it off on time monthly will help start building your credit now. So that when you do want to use it, if you want to buy a car or a house where you're looking at an interest rate of 23%, but on $50,000 instead of $400 for headphones, that's where it can make a huge impact and why you want to kind of start working on that now. And aside from just kind of financing and looking at credit cards more generally, there are some negatives to them that you have to look out for, but there's also some positive things. You can use them for emergencies. I have one credit card that I had when I first got my first credit card, and my car broke down and I needed $3,000 to pay for the repairs. And I was able to do that with a credit card because I didn't have the cash on hand or in my bank at the time. So having that was a great tool to allow me to kind of navigate that situation. You can also get cash back, airline miles. There are a lot of rewards programs with credit cards that encourage you to kind of use your credit and manage it well in a way where you can get rewarded for it. Some of the things you want to look out for, though, is you have a false sense of having more money than maybe you do or than you should be spending. It can also be habit forming. You can continue to build that debt over months if you're not paying the full amount, and that can really build up. And then the things you really want to look out for is having to pay for more than an item's really worth, and never paying your card off completely. So you kind of take the good with the bad, but learning how to manage it will allow you to kind of maximize those positive benefits without really being impacted too much by some of those other things, like accumulating debt. But it's stuff you have to be aware of to really maintain and build towards. Here are just some tips on maintaining good credit. I won't go through all of them, but it's pretty general stuff. Pay your bills on time, pay down your high balances, don't just pay the minimum. Always monitor your savings, checking, and credit card accounts to make sure they're accurate. Be on the lookout for things that maybe look unusual. if you can pay for something with cash and you don't have to use credit, maybe do that. You don't always need to use your credit for everything. Also, just be checking your credit reports. Don't share your personal contact information. It prevents you from being as easily targeted for credit card fraud. So then looking at kind of what some steps you can take throughout the year to make sure you're setting yourself up for kind of the best financial success that you can. An easy one is with your financial aid. If you do have financial aid or federal funding that helps pay towards your charges at BU, just make sure you're aware of renewing that. If you have kind of a deadline for the FAFSA, or if you have additional documents, just make sure you're kind of checking that and submitting them so that you can have everything squared away so that you know that you won't have a balance coming up. Also, make sure you take a look at if you have other requirements like community service for your award, if you have a housing requirement, if you have the Charles River Housing Grant, or any other specific requirement, satisfactory academic progress. Just make sure you're aware of those as you're applying for financial aid so that nothing sneaks up on you and that you know you're all set kind of for the next semester, looking at planning ahead that way. And some other things to remember, make a budget. Find a time frame that works for you, whether it's 1 week, 1 month, 2 weeks. Kind of look at what you make and what you can spend and kind of really work on developing that habit now. It may not seem like a lot right now, but 5 years from now, once you've graduated, having that skill set already built can be hugely important to kind of setting yourself up financially when it matters a little bit more. Same thing with educational loans. Know what you borrow now so that you can plan for kind of repaying that smartly later. Also credit. Credit takes a long time to build. It also lasts a long time. So if you can start making those small positive decisions towards building your credit now, when you need it 5 years from now, if you're buying a car or if you're getting an apartment, you have that established credit there. So you can have more access to that when you want it, rather than graduating, realizing you have to start building your credit and maybe not being able to get a car that you want right away. And then save for the future. That just goes back to making sure you pay yourself. Build a plan towards saving that involves not only kind of those short-term goals, but the long-term goals as well. So you can be meeting those short-term goals while building to kind of a larger goal in the end. Look at what you're saving, if you can add more to it to get that interest compounding so that you can maximize your savings long-term. Doing those little things now. Same thing if you graduate and start contributing just a small amount to retirement. Doing that in your 20s versus your 30s can be an exponential difference to what your savings ends up as. So just kind of being mindful of it, and it's not something you have to start right now, but just being aware of it can kind of help build to that in the long term. So I think we'll also hear from some financial tips from the peer mentors as well now.
Yes, thank you so much, Wyeth. Let me, before we hear some financial tips from Andrew and Emily, ask if there's any questions from our students. I'm seeing one in the chat, which is, if you make a payment on your credit card and pay it in full at the end of the month, will you accrue any interest? I think the answer to that is no, but Wyeth, can you confirm that?
Yeah, so it depends on the credit card in most cases. Most credit cards right now will advertise themselves as zero interest as long as you're making payments on time. So for a lot of them, the answer is yes, you won't accrue any interest if you make the full payment. I recently I know Apple came out with a new credit card, and that's one of the kind of major factors that they advertise. So that's kind of the most recent example. But you do have credit cards that don't have those things. So maybe a credit card that's a little easier to get approved for comes with an interest rate that is going to accrue on every purchase. Also, if you're financing through a credit card company, let's say if you buy something online and they have an option to finance it through MasterCard, there may be interest that accrues there. So you want to make sure you're reading kind of the fine print details. And same thing with like a bank. With as with a bank, with a credit card, you want to be making sure that you find the one that is best for you. So if no interest is kind of a priority, then make sure you kind of narrow your results and in your search to that, rather than maybe one that offers you a lot of cash back. Or if you want cash back, maybe you do that, but know that there's a 1% interest rate. So it's definitely something you want to kind of look at as you're picking which one you want to use.
I'm getting a few questions about getting a credit card to start to build credit, which you talked about, but it's definitely also risky. You just have to know yourself, right? Are you going to be someone that's able to only spend as much money as you have and pay off that credit card every month? Or are you going to be someone that spends way too much and then you end up with a high interest rate and paying it off for a while? So what would you say to that, Wyeth? Like, when is it time to get a credit card to start building that credit score? Would you recommend a credit card versus a debit card? I don't know if you're allowed to give specific credit card suggestions, but there's a question about that.
I'm not allowed to give specific credit card suggestions. You can use any credit card that you would like. But yeah, it's one of those things. First, to distinguish between a credit card and a debit card. A debit card is basically just gives direct access to your your bank account. So it won't help build any credit because it's taking from money you already have. So if you are looking at a credit card, like you said, it's a lot of managing kind of the good with the bad. So you get those benefits, but you have to be wary and know that it is something that you can overspend on and you can accumulate debt. So you want to be mindful of that. If you are mindful of that, the time to get a credit card could be now, because if you start kind of establishing that length of credit, if you start doing that now in your first year versus your first year after graduating, your credit report spans 7 to 10 years. So that's an additional 4 years in your credit history. And you don't have to use it a lot. You can literally just buy a pack of gum or chapstick each month and just pay it off. And that's all you do with that credit card. It'll show 4 years of on-time payments, 4 years of you using your credit and then paying it down, and 4 years of an additional type of credit that's not a student loan. So you're really impacting kind of 3 of those major categories with your credit score with very little effort. So you want to make sure that you are paying it on time and that you're not doing minimum payments, because it could negatively impact you if you do, let's say, use it for a one-time purchase that maybe was beyond your means. And all of a sudden then you are making some late payments or not paying the full amount. That can be much more damaging than the benefit of buying a pack of gum every month. So you want to be really careful with that and make sure that you're going to use it appropriately to get the result that you want. But if you can manage those things, having that additional length in your credit history and those additional payments on time, that's just going to set you up all the better for when you graduate. The first thing students after they graduate usually run into is getting an apartment. And to get an apartment, landlords will do a credit check. So if you have a better credit history there, that's increases your chances of securing maybe the apartment you want, or if you're going to get a car loan, getting the car that you want and not overpaying for it with interest. But that's something, if you start right when you want to do those things, that's not really a long enough time to position yourself to get kind of a smart financial deal on those.
Great, thank you, Wyeth. The other question I'm seeing in here is, since length of history is taken into consideration when calculating your credit score, can they never close their very first credit card? You just mentioned that credit history is 7 years. So how does that kind of factor in to that decision?
Yeah, so it's more of a tip for when you're first starting your credit history. Let's say you take out one card now, and you have it for 4 years, and then after you graduate, you get a second card and you have it for a month, and you like the deals, the cash back on it better, and you don't use the other one, you cancel that, you're cutting 4 years off your credit history. Maybe 10 years after you graduate college and you've had 2 or 3 credit cards all for 7 to 10 years, then canceling one of those doesn't make as big of an impact as you have something else that's giving you that length of credit history. So you kind of want to take a look at your individual scenario. If you have a credit history that's going to be impacted by canceling that card. So if that's your only source of credit history for a long period of time, then you might want to keep it around just to maintain that until you develop kind of another credit history of an equal length.
Great. Another question, will you still have a good chance to get things like a car and apartment without having a credit history?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends. You'll still have a good chance to get them, but that's when it comes to what is the interest rate you might be paying. Apartments are a little bit different in that you don't really have an interest rate on an apartment. So with an apartment, if there are multiple people applying for it, it may be you competing against kind of another person's credit score. So there it is a little bit more important. And landlord, I don't mean to make it like a kind of a doom situation. Landlords are familiar with recent college grads. They don't usually have credits. So it's not that unusual of a thing, but let's say you are looking for somewhere in the city or a certain area where maybe there's a lower supply of apartments and you want something very specific, that's where it can help you. With getting a car or anything that you want to finance, it can definitely make an impact. If you have a credit score of 700 upon graduating, you maybe get a car with 11% interest and you end up paying $1,000 in interest over the lifetime of the loan. Let's say you instead have a credit score of 600. You can end up paying $3,000 to $4,000 in interest over the lifetime of the loan. So that can definitely make a big impact in how much you might pay in interest with anything that you finance. So I think less so with the apartment, but much more with making big purchases where you are dealing with interest. It can definitely make a big difference.
Cool. Thank you very much, Wyatt. I'm going to turn it over to Andrew and Emily, our peer mentors who are here tonight to give some of their tips for living on a budget in college and being smart with your money in college. Emily, why don't you go first?
Well, first, am I allowed to like give a recommendation for a student credit card?
I think you can say what you personally use,
Yeah.
not endorsed by the university.
Okay, not endorsed by the university, but Discover does have a good like student credit card. You like get rewards for like good grades too. They give you like a statement credit, and they don't give you like a crazy high like limit. It's relatively low, and like my card is cute. It's got a little pug on it that's wearing yeah, my brother is like super into financial literacy, and he like shoved this down my throat. And I've enjoyed it. I think it's really helpful. But other than that, don't feel like you have to do all the things that are like expensive. You have time here in Boston to try all those things. You don't have to do them like all at once. I know that's something I kind of felt pressure to like go out to all these restaurants and do all these things that are expensive. But there are a lot of awesome free things to do too, and you can find that like online. There's like a bunch of calendars for the city where you can like find free things to do. Yeah, I think that's probably my biggest piece of advice.
Great. Thank you, Emily. Andrew, what do you have to add to that?
Yeah, so it was a very detailed presentation. So, and also because I am an international student, the way that my credit card thing works a little bit differently. So unfortunately, I would not be able to contribute so much in terms of like, if you have any questions about a credit card. However, I do have some tips about spending and, you know, in college, and specifically in terms of like technology and when you go to your classes, your friends probably bring iPads and like things like that, and it has significantly enhanced their education. And a lot of you may consider purchasing some of this piece of like technology as well. And I've seen a lot of people like, you know, they would go on Amazon and finding like cheap things, and like it breaks after like a week or two, even though they were paying like close to like $100 for it. So this is like a lesson in general, I think, in terms of what you're investing in. So for example, if you're buying an iPad that if you keep it well, you know, like assuming that if you keep it well and it can last for like several years, maybe it is worth it to invest in it instead of buying something that cheap, has bad reviews, and may break after like a couple of weeks. Like I had a new iPad this summer, but it is to replace an iPad that was 9 years old. So I do learn to keep my technology well, and generally because like I can keep things really well. So if I want to invest into something that has a long-term value, I'm willing to pay a little bit extra money to get the value that it can last instead of paying for something that is really cheap but it can break. And I know that college students have this mindset of like always trying to find cheap things that has a good value, which is a good thing. But like sometimes, you know, you get what you pay for. So be careful of not being lured into like the traps of scrolling on Amazon, wasting hours and eventually buying something that might break very soon. So that is kind of like my advice.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew. And advice and quality. It's also more sustainable to use things longer and not throw them out and use lots of new things. So great advice. Wyeth, anything else to add? Do you want to promote Smart Money 101 or any of the financial assistance resources?
Yeah, definitely. And I think I do have one more slide.
Oh, great. Sorry.
Which has our links on it. Definitely, if you are looking, this is kind of like an introduction, but we have more detailed information on all of these things. So if you are looking to look more into your credit or how to build savings, check out our website. We partner with a program called Cash Course, which has already pre-made budgets and different kind of modules that you can look at to dive deeper into all of this. They have weekly, monthly, and annual budgets. We also have tips for kind of living affordably in Boston and different things you can do. All of the resources that are available to students through being Boston University students that are free. Pretty much the gamut of all of these things. So yeah, definitely check it out. See what's available there. And if you are interested in kind of getting more into this stuff, that's a great place to start.
Great. Thank you so much, Wyeth. This was very helpful. I was saying I see this presentation every year, and every year there's something new that I learned. So thanks, Wyeth. Thanks so much, Andrew and Emily, for being here tonight. Thanks to all the students who joined us. We'll hang around for a minute in case there's any lingering questions. Otherwise, good luck with the studying I'm sure you're all doing tonight, and take care of yourselves. Have a good evening.
Thank you.